In 1901, divers found a computer. It was 2000 years old. 30 interlocking bronze gears. Precision engineering that wouldn't appear again for 1500 years. On a shipwreck off the coast of Greece. But everyone talks about the gears. Nobody looked at the ship. April 4th, 1900. The Aegean Sea. A narrow strait just 29 kilometers wide between the Greek island of Crete and a tiny island called Antikythera. Sponge divers working these waters stumble onto something massive on the seabed. A Roman cargo galley, packed from hull to deck with ancient statues, coins, jewelry, and glassware of the finest craftsmanship. The diver who first reached the wreck surfaced in a panic. He thought the seafloor was covered with dead bodies. They were marble sculptures. By 1901, a full salvage expedition was underway. They pulled up bronze statues at near life size. 36 marble sculptures: Heracles, Odysseus, Diomedes, Hermes, Apollo, 3 marble horses, an absolute fortune in antiquities. But the most important find almost ended up in the garbage. Among all this treasure, marble gods and golden coins, someone noticed a small, unremarkable chunk of rock, roughly 20 by 40 centimeters, encrusted with barnacles. They assumed it was a broken piece of statue and tossed it in a crate with the rest. It sat in the basement of the Athens National Museum for years. Nobody looked at it twice, until someone decided to X-ray it, and that changed the history of technology forever. What the X-rays revealed was staggering. Inside this corroded lump were at least 30 interlocking bronze gears with precisely cut teeth, a differential mechanism, gear ratios corresponding to the movements of the sun and moon. This wasn't jewelry or decoration, it was a calculating machine. According to the current scientific consensus, this device could predict solar and lunar eclipses, track the positions of the 5 known planets, calculate the phases of the moon, and perhaps strangest of all, determine the dates of the Olympic Games and other Greek festivals. And then nothing for 1500 years. The conventional history of technology places differential gear mechanisms in the 16th century. That's a gap of over 1500 years, and in that entire gap, nothing. No simpler predecessors, no evolutionary chain. The Antikythera mechanism appears fully formed. There's a contradiction here. But let's set aside the mechanism for a moment, because the rarely discussed part of this story is about the ship, and the ship raises questions that are, in some ways, far more unsettling than the device itself. When you hear ancient Roman galley, you picture something modest, maybe 30 meters long, a trading vessel. But this ship was not that. Initial estimates put it at 30 meters, but those were just rough guesses. The bow and stern had broken off and weren't preserved. The structural evidence told a different story. Extremely thick hull planks, sheathed in lead, roof tiles, indicating a multi-story deckhouse with proper roofing, at minimum 2 decks above the waterline. Some researchers now estimate the ship was around 50 meters long, half a football field. So why was this ship so large? To put that in perspective, the HMS Victory, the flagship of the British Royal Navy, the ship Admiral Nelson commanded at Trafalgar, was roughly the same size. This was not a merchant vessel, this was a floating palace. The ship bore striking similarities to the famous Nemi ships, 2 massive Roman vessels found in Lake Nemi near Rome. Those ships were 70 meters long, 25 meters wide, and contained entire palace complexes with hot baths, plumbing, and statuary. The Nemi ships and the Antikythera wreck date to roughly the same period, same empire, same lead-sheath construction, and historians believe the Nemi ships were built from a standard template, meaning there should be others like them. The evidence suggests the Antikythera ship may be one. And then it gets stranger. 150 meters from the main wreck, divers found the remains of a second ship, a second vessel, traveling alongside. This was a convoy, The cargo had a military escort. Think about what that means. Whatever this ship was carrying was so valuable that it required armed protection at sea. You don't send a warship to guard amphoras of wine. This was a cargo of extraordinary importance to someone very powerful. So, what was the cargo? On the upper decks alone, they found full-size bronze statues, 36 marble sculptures, marble horses, gold and silver coins, and glass vessels of incredible delicacy. And that was just the top layer, the easily accessible stuff. The sculptures themselves raise a question. They were dated to 300 BC, meaning at the time of transport, they were already antiques, 200 years old. Someone was moving irreplaceable ancient artworks across the Mediterranean. Who does that, and why? Who had that kind of power in the ancient world? One theory says the ship was sailing from Greece to Rome, loaded with plundered Greek treasures for a wealthy Roman patron. Another says it was going the other direction, from Sardinia to Rhodes. Either way, someone of enormous wealth and political power commissioned this voyage. There's even a candidate for the intended recipient, the astronomer Hipparchus of Rhodes, one of the greatest astronomers of antiquity. But the dating doesn't quite work. Hipparchus lived about 100 years before the ship's estimated date, so the question remains open. Now consider the loading capacity of this vessel. A ship of that size could carry at least 300 tons. But the items recovered from the wreck, a few dozen statues, some coins, some glassware, come nowhere close to filling it. What else was on board? Where's the rest of the cargo? Here's where the salvage story itself gets suspicious. During the original salvage, 4 marble horses were reportedly accidentally dropped back to the seabed and lost. Marble horses, each weighing hundreds of kilograms, accidentally. And somehow a barnacle-covered rock the size of a shoebox, the mechanism, made it to the surface just fine. In 1976, Jacques Cousteau himself dived the wreck. He found several coins that finally allowed a rough dating, around 85 BC. But the deeper question, what really sank this ship and why so close to shore, remained unanswered. The wreck was found just 100 meters from shore. Why would a ship this size anchor that close? One theory, it was sheltering from a storm like the sponge divers who found it centuries later, but something catastrophic happened. The upper decks were destroyed, possibly burned, and the hull was broken into sections. And buried in the wreck, they found a body. Recent excavations using modern technology found something extraordinary. Buried deep in the sand that filled the lower decks, human remains, a crew member or passenger, preserved under thick layers of sediment. The data suggests something critical about how the ship sank. On the open seabed, organic remains don't last long. Marine organisms consume them within months. But this body was found on an upper deck, buried under a thick layer of sand. The sand must have covered the ship before or during its sinking, not after. The evidence suggests the sand itself caused the disaster. But let's return to the mechanism, because what it actually is and what it was actually for may be simpler and more interesting than the legend suggests. The mechanism is displayed at the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. According to Nature Journal's 2006 CT scan analysis, the most detailed imaging ever performed on an ancient artifact, researchers identified at least 30 precision-cut gears and over 2,000 characters of inscribed Greek text. But here's a problem nobody expected. From the very first examination, researchers noticed something obvious. The internal structure looks exactly like a clock. Gears, a differential mechanism, transmission ratios. These are the same components you'd find inside any mechanical watch. The resemblance isn't subtle. It's the first thing that jumps out. Modern mechanical watches can track the position of the sun, the moon, its phases, and the days of the week, using exactly the same type of gear trains and differential mechanisms. The only difference? The Antikythera device has planetary markers where a watch has hour and minute hands. is that really a computer? Or is it something more familiar? Since 2005, multiple international research projects have competed to reconstruct the mechanism, adding more and more theoretical functions with each iteration. Over 40 astronomical predictions are now attributed to it. But there's a tension here. The more extraordinary the device becomes, the more funding the research attracts. But what if someone already knew what this device was, 2 centuries before it was even found? There's a Persian scholar from the 10th century named al-Biruni who describes something remarkably similar, a device he calls a lunar box. It showed the phases of the moon, positions of the sun and moon, hours, days of the week, and zodiac signs. He simply calls it what it is, a clock in a box. But here's where the story takes its most unexpected turn, in the complete collected works of Mikhail Lomonosov, Russia's great 18th century polymath. There's a passage that appears to have gone unnoticed by Antikythera researchers for over 70 years. In Volume 4, his works on physics, astronomy, and instrument making, Lomonosov describes the problem of maritime navigation. In clear weather, you have stars and astrolabes. But when clouds obscure the sky, he writes, even the best marine clocks and astronomical instruments are useless. A ship captain needs something else. Lomonosov then describes in precise technical detail a self-recording compass, a device that combines a magnetic compass with a spring-driven clock mechanism in a single box. As the clock runs, it turns a drum wrapped in paper, while a pencil attached to the compass needle traces the ship's heading continuously, an automatic course recorder. A box, gears, a dial marked in degrees. Sound familiar? He names the device a meter, a ship's self-recorder, essentially the GPS of the ancient world. He states that every captain should know how to build one, and considers it essential for any serious maritime voyage. Now compare this to the Antikythera mechanism, a box, a clock mechanism inside, a dial with degrees instead of hours, and those 2 mysterious rods found among the fragments, rods whose purpose no researcher could explain. Lomonosov says the paper wraps around rotating shafts. The device writes on them. The paper and pencil, organic materials, would have dissolved in seawater centuries ago. But bronze shafts and metal gears survive. What we're looking at may not be a computer at all. It may be a navigation instrument, a self-recording compass, standard equipment for a ship of this size. This reframing makes the context suddenly logical. An enormous ship with wealthy passengers carrying priceless cargo through a dangerous strait with rocky islands. Of course it had a navigation device. It would be stranger if it didn't. You wouldn't cross the Aegean in a floating palace without one. So how did 70 years of research miss this? And this creates a problem. If the mechanism was a known type of instrument, if Lomonosov could describe its function from existing sources, then how did decades of dedicated research overlook this? Volume 4 of his collected works is not classified. It's on library shelves. Anyone could read it. Lomonosov's historical works had a troubled history. After his death, his house was searched and his historical manuscripts were confiscated on orders from Catherine the Great. Much was edited or suppressed, but his physics and instrument-making texts survived intact. They were just unread. But whether the mechanism is a computer or a compass, one fact remains that no theory can explain away. The precision of its gears, the craftsmanship, it should not exist. Mainstream archaeologists agree on this point. A 2021 study from University College London, published in Scientific Reports, confirmed the gear teeth are cut with sub-millimeter accuracy. The bronze alloy is carefully formulated, copper, tin, and trace amounts of lead in specific ratios. Even by modern standards, the manufacturing is impressive. There's a problem here. Where are the prototypes? Every invention in human history has predecessors. Simpler, cruder versions that gradually improve. The wheel, the printing press, the steam engine. But the Antikythera mechanism has nothing before it and nothing after it for 15 centuries. There's a contradiction here that conventional archaeology still hasn't resolved. This isn't how technology works. You don't go from nothing to a 30-gear differential calculator in one step. The mechanism implies an entire manufacturing tradition, workshops, tool makers, metallurgists, generations of refinement, all of which has vanished without a trace. Unless, of course, it hasn't vanished. Unless we're simply looking in the wrong places. Because the Antikythera mechanism is not the only ancient artifact that displays precision far beyond what the conventional timeline allows. Look at these stones. Now look at the gears. Same precision, different continent. Consider the megalithic walls of Peru. Stones cut and fitted so precisely that you cannot slide a razor blade between them. Surfaces polished to a mirror finish, without power tools, without grinding wheels, supposedly with nothing but hammers and patience. The same kind of precision anomaly, different material, same open question. A practical experiment helps illustrate the point. When you pour concrete into a mold made of smooth plastic, a material with high adhesion resistance, the surface comes out mirror smooth. No cutting, no polishing, just the right mold material. The same principle could potentially explain both megalithic surfaces and precision castings. The debate between cutting and casting continues in alternative archaeology, where the megaliths carved or poured, but this may be a false choice. Modern car manufacturing uses casting, cutting, stamping, and printing, often on the same vehicle. An advanced civilization would use whatever method works best for each situation. The point isn't how they did it. The point is that they did it and then disappeared. Whether the Antikythera gears were cut on a lathe or cast in molds, the civilization that produced them left almost no other evidence of its capabilities. The mechanism is an orphan of history, unless the ship itself is the evidence. And this brings us back to the ship, because the ship tells us something the mechanism alone cannot. It tells us about the world that produced it, a world where vessels the size of Nelson's flagship sailed with military escorts, carrying art collections and precision instruments as routine cargo. A world where a navigational device of extraordinary precision was considered standard shipboard equipment, so ordinary that no one bothered to write about it, where 300 tons of treasures could be shipped across the sea with the same casual efficiency we'd use for a container ship today. The conventional narrative says this was a singular marvel, a one-off genius creation, but the evidence points otherwise. You don't build a 50-meter palace ship to transport a single gadget. The mechanism was one item in a civilization's standard toolkit. Think about how many technologies you'd need just to build this one ship. Think about what it takes to build a ship like this. You need advanced metallurgy for the lead sheathing, sophisticated woodworking for multi-deck construction, plumbing for the onboard baths, architecture for the tiled roof deckhouse, navigation instruments, and the organizational capacity to crew and supply it. This was a full technological civilization, and the mechanism is just one small piece of evidence that survived because it was made of bronze. The wood rotted, the textiles dissolved, the paper vanished. What we found is the skeleton of something far larger. Every few years, a new reconstruction of the mechanism adds more gears, more functions, more complexity. Over 100 models now exist. But with each new version, the mystery doesn't shrink, it grows. Because each added gear implies another level of manufacturing precision that creates a deeper contradiction with the conventional timeline. And the salvage continues. Even now, with modern equipment, researchers are still finding artifacts in the wreck's lower levels. The sand that filled the ship preserved things no one expected, including that human body. What else is buried down there? We may not know for decades. Here's what bothers me most about this story. The glass vessels found on board, delicate, paper-thin glass, were crafted with a skill that rivals modern glass blowing. The statues date to different centuries, suggesting someone was collecting antiquities even then. The ship was a museum in transit, but most of that museum has disappeared. 4 marble horses were lost during the salvage. Bronze statues nearly 3 meters tall were pulled up and put in a museum. 36 marble gods, gold coins. And yet, the items displayed in the Athens National Museum are a fraction of what was reportedly found. Where did the rest go? The museum displays a bronze youth statue nearly 3 meters tall, a philosopher's head, some ceramic lamps, and a handful of amphora fragments. That's it, for a ship that could carry 300 tons. The display raises more questions than it answers. Some have suggested the mechanism was a convenient focal point. Find one mysterious object, make it the center of attention, and the harder questions about the rest of the cargo fade into the background. The missing statues, the unknown owner, the ship's true destination. Whether you find that argument compelling or not, the pattern is striking. The mechanism gets all the headlines, all the documentaries, all the National Geographic specials. The ship, one of the largest ancient vessels ever found, gets a footnote. The escort vessel is rarely mentioned. The missing cargo is seldom discussed. So let's separate the facts from the assumptions. Let's talk about what we actually know versus what we assume. We know the ship was enormous. We know it had an escort. We know it carried treasures spanning multiple centuries. We know a precision instrument was aboard. We know it sank near shore under mysterious circumstances. Everything else is interpretation. We assume it was Greek because it sank near Greece. But the coins found by Cousteau, the ones used for dating, could tell us where the ship had been, not where it was going. A ship that size on a Mediterranean crossing would have carried currency from many ports. We assume the mechanism was special because we found only one. But what if it was common? What if every large vessel carried one and the others simply weren't preserved? Bronze corrodes, wood rots. The Antikythera wreck was unique only because sand buried it quickly enough to preserve the evidence. There's a concept in archaeology called survivorship bias. We only study what survives, and what survives is determined by material, not importance. Bronze and stone last millennia, wood, paper, and cloth last decades. Our picture of the ancient world is like reading a book where every other chapter has been dissolved in acid. The Antikythera ship is a rare window into what's missing. For a few decades, before the wreck was fully excavated, we could glimpse a civilization of staggering capability. Palace ships, military escorts, precision instruments, art collections spanning centuries, all routine, all unremarkable to the people who lived in that world. And then it all disappeared, not gradually, not through slow decline, but abruptly. The Nemi ships were destroyed. The Antikythera vessels sank. The manufacturing tradition that produced precision gears vanished so completely that it took 1500 years to reinvent them. Something happened. The Nemi ships, those incredible 70-meter floating palaces, survived 2000 years on the bottom of a lake. They were finally raised in the 1930s, and then, during World War II, they were burned, destroyed. 2000 years of preservation erased in a single night. Some call these coincidences. A ship sinks, a museum burns, manuscripts get confiscated, key artifacts go missing during salvage. But at some point you have to notice the pattern, and it's worth asking, what's been lost and why does it keep getting lost? The collected works of Lomonosov contain what appears to be a full description of the Antikythera Mechanism's function, written 200 years before the device was even pulled from the sea, mid-18th century, not classified, not secret, just unread. If accurate, this suggests the device was a known category of instrument, not a mysterious one-of-a-kind creation. It was documented in the scientific literature. Its purpose was understood. Calling it an ancient computer was either a genuine misidentification or a framing that served other purposes. And there's a dark irony in the name. Lomonosov called this type of device a klesia meter. Today, that same word meter refers to a medical instrument for measuring the female pelvis. The original meaning was replaced with something completely unrelated. The maritime definition simply vanished from dictionaries. So let's assemble what we have. An enormous ship, roughly the size of an age of sail flagship, a military escort, cargo including artwork spanning centuries, being moved by someone with extraordinary wealth and power, a precision navigation device, and a catastrophic sinking just meters from safety. The ship was buried in sand, not just covered by sediment over centuries, but rapidly engulfed. The body found on the upper deck was preserved because sand reached it before marine life could. This doesn't match a storm or a battle. It matches something much more sudden. The ship's bow and stern broke off. The upper decks were destroyed, possibly burned. The hull fractured into sections. This is massive structural failure, not the gradual settling of a ship that simply took on water. Whatever ended this vessel was violent and fast. The coral reef in that area means the seabed is hard, not sandy. Yet the ship was buried in sand. Sand that had to come from somewhere else. A landslide? A tsunami? There's another possibility. Whatever catastrophe buried the ship in sand may have been the same event that sank it. We may never know what destroyed this ship, but we can say what it tells us about the world it came from. It suggests that 2000 years ago, someone had the wealth, the technology, and the organizational power to build palace ships, fill them with centuries of art, equip them with precision instruments, and protect them with a navy. And that world produced the Antikythera Mechanism, not as a miracle, but as a tool so common that scholars 2 centuries ago could describe it from memory, a tool so well understood that its description survived in physics textbooks while the object itself lay forgotten under the sea. The next time you see a documentary about the Antikythera Mechanism, pay attention to what they leave out: the ship, the escort, the missing cargo, Lomonosov. They'll show you the gears and call it a mystery, but the real mystery is the ship. The Antikythera mechanism isn't evidence of one genius inventor. The evidence suggests an entire civilization that we've somehow lost. A civilization with industrial metallurgy, precision manufacturing, advanced navigation, palace-class shipbuilding, and organized military logistics. All of it gone. All of it waiting to be rediscovered, perhaps in the lower decks of that sand-filled wreck. Everyone talks about the gears. Almost no one talks about the ship. Maybe it's time we started, because a barnacle-covered rock in a museum basement is interesting, but a 50-meter warship carrying the treasures of a lost civilization across a sea that no longer remembers them